Hey folks, and welcome back. All right, so we are on our way to arguing that there is a point to holding corporations morally responsible for their actions. There is a point because there are cases, or at least there possibly are cases, where corporations bear responsibility for some outcome, and no individual can rightly be held responsible for that outcome. And we're going to argue that holding corporations responsible could actually shape corporate behavior, could actually control corporate behavior in some way. We're on the first part of that, Phillips' first question, right? That there are cases where corporations bear responsibility, but no individual in the corporation bears responsibility. And he's argued that those cases exist when a corporation acts for corporate reasons and brings about some harmful event. So it intentionally acts to bring about some event, and that event leads to some harm to some group or individuals, some persons. And the corporation as a whole is in a position to know enough to have foreseen that harm. If they foresaw it but acted anyways, they were reckless. If they didn't foresee it, they were negligent for not foreseeing it, even if no individual within that corporation could be held responsible because of defective organizational design that prevents any particular individual or group within the organization from knowing what they would have needed to know to act to prevent that harm. So those are the cases where the corporation can be held responsible, but no individual is responsible or bears responsibility. But there are a couple of puzzles that we need to wrestle with now, because all of this hinges on the idea of defective organizational design that makes it the case that corporations are culpable when particular individuals within the corporation are not. If the corporation is poorly designed, then that's a possibility. But biological human beings design corporate structures and policies, right? The corporation doesn't design itself. It doesn't, magically constitute itself. It's designed by people. It's incorporated by people, by biological human beings. So why aren't those biological human beings responsible for the defective organizational design, and so for the bad acts and outcomes that follow from it? Why should we hold the corporate whole responsible? Why shouldn't we just hold these individual biological human beings responsible? Supposing that no individual can be found responsible, on what grounds could the corporation be responsible for defective organizational design? Right? So supposing that we say that in fact, there are no individual human beings responsible for this bad corporate design, then on what grounds could we reasonably say that the corporation itself is responsible for this defective design? So let's see how Phillips tries to address these two puzzles. So the first one is this puzzle of individual culpability for defective organizational designs. And the way that he responds is by appealing to some organizational psychology here. Right? Organizations shape the behavior and beliefs of their members, he says. They are what we might call formative institutions as opposed to performative institutions. That is, they are institutions that have as part of their aim to shape the individual constituents of the institution so that they behave in particular ways, so that they believe particular things, so that they will make judgments in particular ways. And we can see this. If we think about things like corporate culture, if we think about different corporations having different corporate cultures and ingraining that culture in the members of that organization. Right? We see this when we think about the classic company man, the person who has so imbibed the the organizational culture, the beliefs, commitments, and goals of the corporation, that it is basically constitutive of who they are, makes them the person that they are. Corporations and other institutionalized collectives, he says, socialize their members to internalize group perceptions and values. These institutions socialize their members so that the people who are a part of them see the world in the same way and have some of the same values. Yes, there's some diversity among them, and we hope there's a great deal of diversity among them, but there are certain commitments that they're going to have to share to be part of this corporation. And he gives us some examples of when this happens and when it kind of goes possibly too far, right? When some of these features of organizational psychology could, in fact, interfere with individuals reshaping corporate or organizational design. So one of them is groupthink. Groupthink he defines as the process by which group members so thoroughly internalize collective goals and perceptions that they are literally incapable of realistically evaluating, let alone changing, existing group practices, right? They're in such a position that they follow one another off the cliff, right? They follow, they simply follow what their leader is telling them to do or what the corporation is telling them to do. They've been so socialized into this institution that they share its goals and perceptions, and they can't see the wrong that it does. They can't see the failures that exist in its practices. And even if they could sometimes glimpse the failures that are built into these corporate practices, they'd stand no chance of changing them because they'd face such reprisal from their peers for trying to change things, for trying to blow the whistle, that they have strong reason not to act here, strong practical reason not to act. They don't want to face that reprisal. They value being part of this corporation. So that's what he means by groupthink. And then there's the phenomenon of risky shift. People in groups tend to choose collective actions that are more dangerous than they would choose individually. They tend to make decisions that are more risky when they are part of the group and on behalf of the group than they would if they were acting on their own, because, well, they, it seems, think that the collective bears the risk. They're not bearing the risk on their own. And so people are more likely to take risks that they think on their own wouldn't be worth taking, but that the organization, well, maybe should take or can take because the risk is somewhat distributed for the organization. So are groupthink, risky shift, and other organizational psych phenomenon exculpatory? That is, do they get individuals off the hook for poor organizational design or defective organizational design? Well, they are if we buy a principle of ethics that is pretty deeply ingrained in the way we think about ethics. It's that ought implies can, right? That if you say that someone ought to do something, you're implying that it's something they are capable of doing. And the contrapositive of this is that cannot implies ought not, right? If someone literally cannot do something, then they ought not do it. They can't have an obligation to do it. You can't be obligated to perform an act that is impossible for you to perform. You can't be held liable for an act or omission that you couldn't avoid or couldn't perform. If these forces are strong enough that they literally prevent individuals from acting to reshape defectively designed policies and practices, then individuals are off the hook. They're not responsible for failing to do so. So they are exculpatory. Okay, let's move on to the second puzzle. If individuals are off the hook because of these features of organizational psychology, why are corporations themselves liable for defective design? Well, Phillips says corporate entities have capacities that greatly exceed individual human beings. They have much greater might and resources. Again, that's the point of having a corporation. They can and should have access to practical and theoretical knowledge which dwarfs that of individuals. They can and must, he says, exercise superhuman intelligence. We rely on corporations to be better than individuals. We wouldn't have constructed corporations if it wasn't the case that they would be able to be more effective in their actions than any particular individual could be. And we expect them to exercise this greater access to practical and theoretical knowledge in order to make better decisions. We think that corporations ought to have fail-safes built in. We think that they ought to have an organizational structure that is self-reflective, that is, that looks back at itself or looks back on itself to assure that the way it makes decisions is positive, is good. That corporations, we might think, should perform quality assurance on themselves. They ought to be self-reflective in this way. And they can be held as a result to a higher standard. Corporation can't get off the hook because of these features of organizational psychology. It should have policies that are aimed at promoting whistleblowing, promoting people who are on the lookout, or promoting people to be on the lookout for these kinds of policy and practice failures within the organization. Recall what French said about the possibility that corporations are better suited to moral behavior than biological human beings. He thought that they were perhaps more responsive to reasons than individual human beings are, because they are not affected by all of these emotions bombarding them and pushing them to act in various ways. Right? The same idea is going on here. Phillips is saying corporations sort of should be cold and calculating and figure this out and be able to figure out how to act. They shouldn't be subject to these sort of failures of human psychology. Right? All right, so we've now got the first part of Phillips' argument, that there are cases where there's defective organizational design, where corporations can be held responsible for their intentional actions, and no individual member of that corporation bears any responsibility, or bears full responsibility at least. We'll come back with one more lecture to wrap this up.